Well, that's been a while. Hey everyone, it's Devlog time again, and this time there are a ton of changes and additions made, like for example the first ever boss fight for this game. And if you like what you see in this video, feel free to subscribe and like, it would really mean a lot to me. So before we can start with the new progress, I'd like to introduce the game to you so you know what's going on. Caves of Umbra is a roguelike game split in two phases: the mining phase, where you collect resources and progress through randomly generated levels, and the combat phase, which is all about fighting different enemies, like in for example Enter the Gungeon or the Binding of Isaac. During the mining phase you constantly lose energy, so you have to enter the combat phase to regain a part of it. And with that, we can start with the addition of a saving system. This is a really important feature because with this system in place, weapons or resources won't be lost after each level anymore. I already set this system up so that the saves get cleared when the run is over, like for every single roguelike game. This way I also need to code another saving system that contains all information saved across runs, but this is a task for whenever I add a sort of hub to the game. For now, I just save the player health, resources like for example gold, and weapons with this run saving system, but in the end I can easily expand on this when I need to. For this devlog I mainly had one mission in mind: improving the game's combat. And what is a key part of this? The rooms all of this takes place in. Before any of the changes, these were boring and generic, rarely being separated by some walls. So with the new version I wanted to go with the style I used in a past game called Circle Survivor, having rocks as obstacles that made the fighting area more interesting in shape, but this is obviously not enough. Because for better game feel, it always helps adding objects that interact with the player. On the one hand, I use the approach of just a visual change for these bone piles here that get destroyed when the player or an enemy walks through them. But I also use the approach of you being able to destroy an actual obstacle for these barrels here. As you can see, these changes make a huge difference for the combat rooms, but 2 interactive objects is really not a lot, which is why I'll definitely come back here at some point and add in more of these. After this, I didn't focus all of my time on the development of this game, but I also built my new setup along with my brand new PC. This setup really makes a lot of things possible for my game development journey, and it's just a different experience than working on a simple laptop. I did, however, fix a lot of different little bugs that were also long overdue, which was also a really important but quite boring task, so I think we better skip to a more interesting one. Now that the game is working better than ever, the time has come. I finally decided to stop the player from having infinite health, or in short, it is time to make the player be able to die. So I first experimented with different designs for a fitting game over screen and finally decided on this. On the top we got a skull, which later turned into the skull of the player character. Below that, the level you reached, then a display for the collected resources, an in-game timer, and at the very bottom 2 buttons for either returning to the hub that still needs to be made, or a quick restart button. As you can see, the current state of the desk screen doesn't feature a few of the listed ideas, which is because things like level progression just aren't figured out yet. After this, I also quickly added a few lines of code so that the game over screen appears when the player's health is less or equals to 0, or when you get killed by the collapsing cave. I think it's time for the thing you probably all waited for and why you clicked on this video in the first place. Starting with the very first boss for my game, I sat down collecting various ideas. I quickly realized the theme I want to go for with the boss for the abandoned mineshaft area. I imagined an ancient machine or warrior that attacks using separately flying hands. I later settled on 6 hands in total, 2 throwing bullets, 2 hovering fists, and 2 using massive swords. Then I wanted to figure out how many different phases the boss should feature and what these look like. Here I ended up splitting the boss into 3 phases in total, introducing a new hand type every new phase. So the first phase is just the 2 bullet throwing hands, the second one adds the fists, and the last adds the hands with the swords. After I figured out the general design of the boss, I moved on to a slightly different task that still was relevant to the boss fight. I'm talking about the new boss block that behaves just like the monster block, but instead of entering a normal combat room, you enter the boss fight. I created the boss level in the mining phase with 3 normal cave chunks and 1 last containing the boss block. So it acts like a sort of introduction to the boss fight. After I added this block, I also added a shader effect to the boss and monster block using the all-in-one shader asset from the Unity asset store. This little change was the start of me changing a few game feel and visual related things of the game, such as creating a completely new sprite for the chest or intensively tweaking the post-processing and lighting. On top of that, I realized realized the lack of visual effects, which is why I started changing and adding a lot of these as well. My favorite outcomes here are probably the chest opening effect with the lock shipping off like that, and this shockwave effect for the bullet clear secondary action that I made using a ripple shader I also used in my previous big game project. Lastly, I added an effect that I wanted to add for a really long time, which is the player dropping in an elevator at the start of a level. You might have already seen that at the end of each level the player needs to enter a broken elevator to continue, so I think it would be really fitting if you also drop down with this elevator at the start. When you then touch the ground, this elevator immediately breaks into pieces and you're able to move. This took quite some time due to the fact that I needed the camera to follow this, which is often difficult because I use two cameras in the game, one for the mining and the other for the combat phase. Back to the development of the boss. I now have the idea mostly figured out, so I began creating the art for it. After I was happy with the boss design, I separated the respective body parts, so I ended up with this sprite sheet here. I then reassembled these parts in Unity so I can animate the boss without having to draw a new sprite every frame. Then I wrote the script for the hand thrown bullets when I noticed that the boss fight will probably not turn out very fun and special because all hands just perform one type of attack and are pretty much disconnected from the actual boss. After going through a couple of concepts, I then came up with the idea of not only adding a new hand type every phase, but also a special attack. To perform a special attack, both hands of a type move to the boss and collaborate for this attack. I quickly came up with an attack for every type and decided to hurry up programming the basic attacks for every hand type so I can move on to the special ones. For the first phase, I made this circular bullet attack, for the second this shockwave-like attack, and for the last one this double-sided sword spin. Now you probably think that I'm done with the boss fight, but I just want to add a few things. For example, we got the health bar for the boss, where I also added this white part to see how much damage you have dealt, then this simple intro animation later part with this overlay here, and of course we need to clear the room when the boss is defeated. For this I also made this red gem that I also added to the body of the boss and the boss block as a reward after fighting the boss. But I think I'm going to talk more about my ideas for its function when it's time for the game's story and progression. For now, however, that is it with this first boss fight and all the other changes made along the way. The next steps for the development will mainly be upgrading the other area called Whitewood Hollows and also creating a sort of shop in between the areas. If you don't want to miss these future development updates, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to this channel and like this video. I hope I see you next time. Cheers.